Madam Chair, Director Mulvaney, thank you for being here today, and thank you for the hard work that you've put into this budget proposal. It is refreshing to see a proposal that actually balances in 10 years. Tough situation. Anytime you talk about cutting anything, somebody's not going to be happy about that. But it takes courage to put these cuts on the table. We may not all agree with the same areas where we need to prioritize spending, but I think we all, at least on this side of the dais, agree that we have to do something about the debt that's in our country and the burden that it's putting on our children, our future generations. So I appreciate the courage that you took in putting forth this. You know, I've read the headlines about draconian cuts and deep budget cuts. So, you know, I like to go back and look at the numbers. And as I study these numbers, there's a phenomena here that I think the general public may not understand, and maybe even a lot of people in D.C. don't totally understand. But we have this process called the baseline budget. And as I look at the baseline budget, over the 10-year window, it starts at $4.1 trillion and it goes to $6.7 trillion. That's $2.6 trillion of increase over the 10-year window. That's a 63% increase. So if you simplify it and average that, that's 6.3% increase in each of the 10 years for the next 10 years. That's the baseline. So if we look at the budget, this so-called draconian budget that you've proposed, it starts at $4.1 trillion. It goes to $5.7 trillion in 2027, which is a $1.6 trillion increase over the 10-year window, or a 39% increase, or 3.9% per year over that 10-year window. Could you explain in a little more detail about how, when we say cut in Washington, D.C., and I served in my state legislature as well, where we had to balance the budget. I worked in a business where when we talked about a cut, it was less money next year than it was the year before. And my home and the other families I know in my district, when they talk about a cut to their budget, it actually means you spend less money next year than you spent last year. However, in D.C. in budgeting, we can still spend more money than we spent last year and call it a cut somehow. Would you explain that in more detail?
Sure. Here's how I used to do it back home when I was trying to explain it to people. In Washington, D.C., if we spent $100 on a program last year and $100 on a program this year, back home we would call that a freeze. In Washington, we call that a cut. If we spent $100 on a program last year and $104 on a program this year, back home we would call that an increase. In Washington, D.C., we call that a cut. Back home, if you spent $100 last year and $106 this year, back home you call that an increase. Here we call it a freeze. And it's not until you spend $100 last year and $108 this year that we call it an increase in both normal, back home English, and Washingtonese. And that's because of what you mentioned, baseline budgeting. The baseline assumes that we're going to grow the government at population plus inflation, I think, every single year. And it leads to that. I can't tell you the number of people used to come to my office, Mr. Westerman, and say, 2 years ago, oh, you cut my budget on this. I'm like, no, we didn't. They said, well, everyone's telling me you cut my budget. I said, no, all we did was grow it slower than otherwise. And they said, well, that sounds like an increase. And I said, yes, it does. And they said, well, why is everybody telling me it's a cut? I said, so you will come to Washington and tell me to give you more money. That's how the system works, and that's why I am a big fan of zero-based budgeting, getting away from the baseline and actually using English language that people can understand. If you want to be real cynical about it, under the world where we spent $100 last year and $104, okay, to your conservative friends back home, and we all have them in both parties, you could say, you know what, I cut that program, because in Washington that's a cut. But to your more liberal-minded friends back home, and we all have those in both parties, you say, you know what, I like that program too. We spent more money on that. And both of those statements are right, one using back home English and one using Washingtonese. And I think it's part of the thing that undermines the credibility of the institution, that we have to start speaking a language up here that everybody can understand. So I thank you for drawing attention to the effort. I do encourage this committee to continue to look at ways to articulate how we spend money better. Go back to my opening statement, explaining to people how much government really costs them, because I think in the long term, folks in both parties will be well served by that. But thank you for that question.
I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back.